Hi, I'm Celia Wexler, Vice President of SPJ DC Pro Chapter. With me tonight is audio investigative journalist Sarah Ventre. Sarah, a graduate of Arizona State University, has been in the journalism business for about a dozen years. Over that time, she's achieved career success and advancement. The outlets she has produced for include NPR, PBS, Gimlet, Vox, Critical Frequency, Crooked Media, Campside Media, and the Moth. Her podcast, Unfinished Short Creek, about a fundamentalist Mormon community on the Utah-Arizona border, was hailed as one of 2020's top podcasts by both the New Yorker and the Atlantic. And her reporting there earned her an Edward R. Murrow Award for journalistic excellence. In this turbulent decade for journalists, Sarah's managed to survive and thrive. I'm sure we all would like to know just how she did that. If you have questions or comments for Sarah, please put a box, not the chat box. I'll address them, and Sarah, if she sees a question, also has the freedom to comment as well. Sarah, first of all, I really want to drill down into your career, starting with two very basic questions. When did you decide you wanted to be a journalist, and why?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be with you all. And I used to live in DC and I love DC, so I'm really excited. I kind of came to journalism in a little bit of a roundabout way. When I was in college, I had a friend who was a music journalist. And at that time, I didn't even think that music journalism was the same as other kinds of journalism. And I was really interested. I loved music. I cared a lot about it. I was part of my local music scene. And so I decided I wanted to try writing about music. And so I started with some very, very small publications in the Phoenix area. I started working as the music director at my college radio station. And then I started working for the Phoenix New Times, which was a Village Voice Media publication, the alt weekly in Phoenix. And I really loved writing about music, and I really loved telling stories. And at that point, I never thought that I would work in any other kind of journalism, but I applied for an internship at NPR Music, and I got an internship at All Songs Considered, which this was back in 2010. So it was a very, very early podcast, and NPR All Songs Considered was doing the tiny desks at that point. So I was kind of working at the tiny desk and writing about music, and I really loved the environment at NPR. I wanted to stay there. I thought it was so beautiful that people were interested in telling really nuanced, complex stories, and at that time, specifically around music, I wanted to be part of that. And someone said to me, well, if you really want to stick around here, you need to learn how to cut tape and try to work for some of the news shows. And I felt so overwhelmed because I had never worked in news before, and I felt so unqualified. I didn't study journalism. My degree is in anthropology. And I decided I needed to stick around. And so I kind of started that hustle, and then eventually began working for news shows. And when I saw that there could be a full-time job potentially, or some combination of jobs that would allow me to talk to people and ask lots of questions and be in communities that I never thought I'd get to be in, I just really fell in love with that idea.
Well, it sounds so that to be just told, well, if you can learn to do X and Y and pick up journalism skills, there may be a career for you, kid. So what did that mean when you said I had to really hustle?
Yeah, so to be clear, no one said there could be a career for you, but they said if you want there to be a chance of there being a career for you in audio in particular, this is what you have to learn how to do. So tell me, so the question was like, what did it mean to hustle? Is that how you said it?
Exactly. I mean, it's
Yeah.
one thing for somebody to tell you this is what you need to do. It's another thing to figure out how to do it.
Yeah. Well, I was lucky in a couple of ways. So one was that first I was lucky enough to get the NPR internship. And then at the time, the internships were unpaid. The internships are paid now. They were unpaid at the time, and I couldn't afford to do an unpaid internship. So I worked as a live-in housekeeper when I was in DC in exchange for free rent in order to enable my ability to like live in DC and then do the internship. So I was lucky, first of all, that I had enough privilege to even be able to do that, because I think not everybody does. Secondly, I was really lucky that there were a lot of kind people I met who, even if they didn't mentor me in an official capacity, they acted as mentors or guides to me. And one person in particular, Linda Holmes, who works at NPR, she's one of the hosts of Pop Culture Happy Hour. We were working in the same part of the building, so our desks were near each other when I was an intern. And she could see that I was feeling discouraged. I was worried that I didn't have the skill set to stay. I was pitching lots of stories to outlets outside of NPR that weren't getting picked up. And she took me out for coffee one day and said, you need to remember that not hearing back from someone is not a rejection. And sometimes even a rejection isn't a rejection. And unfortunately, this is like a field where you just really have to keep hustling. And I really internalized that advice. And what it looked like in practical terms was that, again, because I couldn't afford to be in DC otherwise, when my internship ended, I got a job as a daytime bartender. And I worked like as a bar manager and a bartender a few days a week. And the days of the week that I wasn't working at the bar, I would go into NPR and get a friend to buzz me into the building. And I would do one of two things. I would either sit in a production booth, and then I would take the audio from that morning's morning edition, and I would take the raw interview that like one of the hosts had done, and then I would cut it to, so like let's say the interview was a half hour, I would try cutting it to 3.5 minutes and see if I could do it. And then I would get somebody to listen to it and tell me how it sounded. And they would be like, oh, your cuts are too tight, or you kind of missed an important part of the interview, or something like that. So I would work on that, and I would practice, and then I would listen to what actually aired and see how close mine was to what actually aired. And I would practice for many, many hours alone in the edit booth. And then the other thing is that when I started just having enough of a basic ability to cut audio, I would take copies of my resume and walk around the building and wait outside the offices of the executive producers of all of NPR's shows. And then as soon as they came back to their office, I would say, hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm interested in working for you, and here's a copy of my resume, and do you have a minute to talk? And usually they would say, no, why don't you come back in like a couple hours? And then I would go downstairs and get myself a coffee and then come back in a couple hours. And then they'd say, I can't talk to you today, come back tomorrow. And then I'd come back tomorrow. So it was like that for months. I mean, I think there was probably about 6 months when I was literally walking around the building with copies of my resume. And NPR in particular is a unique place because I think the system has changed a little bit since then, but at the time, they really relied heavily on, they called them temps. So you would get a temporary position at NPR that might last a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And the understanding was that you had to kind of be a temp for a certain amount of time before you could get considered to be hired for a full-time job. Eventually, I did get temp work, and I was a temp at NPR for probably about 3 years. I never got hired for a full-time job at NPR headquarters. But I worked at all of the shows I think almost all of the shows at NPR during those 3 years.
It's really remarkable in the sense that it really tells the story of what it takes to make it in a very exacting and hard, difficult profession. And the fact that you stuck with it. How did you, I mean, I realized that you had sort of a quasi mentor in Linda Holmes, and that's great. But how did you not go completely, what kept you going? How did you not get completely discouraged?
I did get really discouraged. I got discouraged a lot. And I was really scared that I just didn't have it in me, or I wasn't talented enough, or that I wouldn't be good enough. Since then, I've had a lot of conversations with people who have helped me realize that we all have the ability to do many, many things. And some of us have had more opportunities or more privileges in life that have given us the opportunity to really focus in on honing a skill than others. And so now I think if I was going back and talking to, 25-year-old Sarah, I would have told her, like, hey, you just need to really work at this. This is like a thing that's, really difficult and really hard, and it takes everybody a long time. And you haven't had as much time to work on it as a lot of other people have. So get to work. But I think at the time, I just, it was something that I knew I really wanted, and I didn't feel ready to give up. And I could kind of see that, like, in my intern class, only 2 or 3 of us stuck around and tried to temp. And then I think I was the one that well, there was me and one other person had stuck around the longest. And I, at some point, realized it was a game of waiting and a game of like showing up. And would I continue to be the one that showed up every day, or would I eventually say, I don't want to do this anymore and leave? And I think there's valid reasons to choose both things. But when I realized that a lot of it was showing up, I thought, okay, I can do that. I don't need a huge skill set to show up. I just need to keep doing it.
We have a question. Sarah, can you see it? And feel free to respond to this person. It's an anonymous person but it's somebody trying to break into the industry.
Sure. So the question says, I graduated and have had a tough time getting into news. I am podcast editing for a marketing company, but don't know where to go from here. How can I translate my editing skills into something a news station or podcast would want? It's a good question. Um, I mean, I think that, part of it is making sure you're willing to kind of, and it sounds like this person is willing to work at sort of different layers and different levels. I think sometimes it's a thing where you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so if you're transferring your skills working for a marketing company into working for news or long form documentary podcasts, can you cut tape cleanly? Can you mix audio? Do you have that sort of foundational skill set? And it sounds like this person does. So what I would tell them is, whatever sort of level you're at right now in terms of pay or in terms of title, try to get the equivalent, but also be willing to sort of take a step back. The other thing is that the audio industry is not in very good shape right now. And so there's not a lot of jobs, particularly full-time jobs. I don't have a full-time job. I work a bunch of contract jobs and piece it together. So the other thing I would say is, while you're working your marketing job, see if you can get a contract job producing a podcast that you just think is interesting, even if it doesn't pay particularly well. You can also approach people who have podcasts that you like. Kind of, I've done that before, just cold reach out to them and say, I really like what you make. Here's who I am. Here's what I do. Like, I don't know if you ever need help, but keep me in mind. And it might be sort of like laying a base that you can like come back to later. A lot of these things don't happen very quickly. I mean, I would say also remember, so I interned unpaid for 3 or 4 months. Then I had 6 months where I couldn't get any work for NPR. They weren't taking me at all. Then I started temping just a little tiny bit. Then it took another 3 to 6 months before I got regular temp work. And then I temped for another 2.5 or 3 years. So and I don't think that should be the system for everyone, but I say that to say that sometimes it means starting to move into the subfield or the part of the industry that you really want to in really small ways, and then building it up from there. But I would say cold reach out to people, meet as many people as you can, write to people who have podcasts that you like. And the other thing you can do too is your local NPR station sometimes will need part-time production assistants or something like that. And that's a good way to start stepping into news and also getting to know the people in your community who do that kind of work.
Oh,
I
we
see we have
more
lots of questions. Yeah.
Yes. Feel free to answer them, Sarah.
Sure. Okay. Podcasts are very expensive. I'm wondering if you know of any ways to produce a high quality podcast that doesn't cost $250,000 or more. It depends on what kind of a podcast you want to produce. If you're talking about an investigative documentary podcast, I do think that's about what they cost to make, which unfortunately a lot of companies don't have the budget for or don't want to pay for. There are ways to make cheaper ones, but they may not have all of the things that you want them to have. So I would say think about doing something smaller and digestible. Not everything has to be an 8 to 10 episode series. Could you make a really brilliant 1 hour episode of something that could live on an existing show? Could you make something that requires less production time? And think really strategically about where you are willing to put in money and where you're willing to cut back on money. So like I would never skimp on a fact checker, for example. That feels really important to me. But I've had to, there are some times where I've wanted to have two editors to work with, like a story editor and a line editor, and there's just no budget. And so one person is editing the granular level and the high level, and you're just like wearing multiple hats. Or I've been a producer on a show where I was also the line editor. So like there's things like that happen too. But yeah, documentary, narrative, investigative, long form are very expensive to make. And the biggest expense is people's salaries, which I don't think is a good idea to cut on. So there are companies that are trying to make things faster and faster and like make them in under 6 months. And I've been on shows like that where it's really hard and it can be very stressful and not always realistic. So the other thing is you can look for funding in different ways. You can look for a traditional distributor, a commercial company. You can look for grants. Universities often make really good partners, nonprofit partnerships. There's like a lot of ways to slice it, but it's just a really tough time right now. And I think that's a valid thing to be struggling with. Okay, the next question says, I tend to focus more on video content, but I'm considering starting a personal/experiential podcast. Do the skill sets for editing cross, or are there very specific audio skills that I don't even know about yet? So the principles are the same. If you know how to edit for video, you know how to make clean cuts, and it's a little harder to make clean cuts in video because you're making a clean audio cut that matches with a clean video cut. So I would say that the skills are probably very transferable. I know that in video, they use different terminology for things. So I think video editing is what we often call audio production. So I would say your skills are probably very transferable, but what likely has to happen is that you may need to learn a different, they're called DAWs, digital audio workstations. Like you might need to learn Pro Tools instead of Adobe or something like that. So my guess is that those are pretty transferable skills. But again, it's hard because there aren't as many jobs right now. So just keep that in mind as you're looking. This person says, I am in the exact same spot hunting for contract production and associate production roles. What have been the best resources for finding those roles in your experience, especially as a new producer? 2 independent productions under my belt thus far. Well, congrats on having 2 independent productions under your belt so far. That's great. And that I feel like getting those first couple are really hard to get. The resources I use, I mean, they're pretty like, as many as you can think of, right? So again, this is a constant hustle. And really, when I thought about that, not hearing back is not a rejection. And sometimes even a rejection isn't a rejection. It's made me feel more comfortable being bold about reaching out to people, not in an entitled way and not in an obnoxious way, but to be able to reach out. So number one is there's this audio listserv. It's called Public Radio NYC. People just refer to it as the listserv. It started out as a listserv for people in audio in New York, and it expanded to become a listserv for people who work in audio all over the world. People are constantly posting contract positions, full-time positions, part-time positions on there. So I would look on that. There's one called Tanya's Tips. They do a lot of cross posts on there, but that one is specifically for people looking for jobs. I'm a member of the Association for Independence in Radio, or AIR. They have a directory. So sometimes when people are looking for a contract producer, I used to live in Arizona. I live in New York now. When people were looking for contract producers in Arizona, they would look up who's in Arizona, and there were only a handful of us. And so they would find me, and my handful of colleagues then maybe reach out to me and say, hey, can you do a tape sync in Phoenix? Or, hey, I need a producer in Tucson. Do you know of anyone? That's a really good way. I would say conferences, to the extent that you're able to go to them. There was one called Resonate this year that I think it was the first year that this one happened, that I heard really great things about. I have not been to it. Third Coast used to be the main audio conference, and Third Coast is now, I believe, entirely virtual. And then the other thing is just like anytime you can be meeting people or talking to people, and I think this is really important. If you think of this as a community and you don't do it in a transactional way, it not only helps you, it helps build the community. So I think one thing that's really hard about networking is that sometimes it can feel like we're asking for something from somebody else or they're asking for something from us. But if you think about it as building relationships with people who are colleagues, who you respect, who you're interested in, you can think of it as a mutual community of support. And so part of it is just like finding the people who do work that you love, that you care about, that you think is interesting, and reaching out to them to either ask them questions, to compliment them and tell them that their work was meaningful to you, and or to tell them like, I'd love a chance to work with you in the future, so if you ever need a producer, let me know. I one time was doing a tape sync, which is where somebody in a city wants to record somebody in another city, and so they, like, somebody in DC hired me to go to someone's house in Phoenix and record them in their house, so they got a good clean recording. The person that hired me, I found out who they were and what the podcast was, and it was this academic whose work I really admired. And I wrote to the producer of the podcast, and I wasn't expecting anything, by the way. I just said, hey, it's really cool that I got to work with you all. I really admire this scholar. I think her work is so interesting. If you guys ever need any production help in the future, let me know. I'd love to be able to work with you again. 6 months later, they were like, actually, we do need help. We need help cutting this podcast. Are you free to like cut this for us once a week? And I was like, I would love to. So you never know how things are going to pan out. And I would say, like, be open when other people come to you and be open to going to them. Okay, Kristen says, if I'm pitching a podcast in my spare time of sorts, how much time should I set aside? I'm interested in producing a pilot episode in the next 6 months. So I think it depends on what type of podcast it is. If you're talking about an investigative narrative podcast, or if you're talking about what is sometimes called a chat cast, but more of like a conversational podcast, those sort of take different amounts of time. Companies tend to be more interested in what they call always on podcasts now, which are the ones that like come out once a week. They tend to be more conversational, or they're stories that can be produced more quickly and aren't limited run narrative series. How much time should you set aside? If it were me, I would probably set aside like 2 hours one day a week, and then like an hour 2 additional days a week or something like that, because it's really draining to do over and over again. And you're going to have to do a lot of like following up with people you reached out to, and then they're not going to like follow up to your follow-ups. You're going to have to reach out to them again, and then you're going to be like researching new places. But I would say like maybe 4 or 5 hours a week, but spread it out. And I had some people that I would be like, I wrote them on Mondays for 2 or 3 weeks and they didn't write back to me. So then I started writing them on Wednesdays because I thought maybe Monday was a busy day for them. So you have to kind of like be willing to like adjust and, play the hustle game. Okay, this person says, I am a trained fact checker and want to work with podcasts as a fact checker. Any advice on how to connect with a pod for this role, part-time, remote? Should I go to a production company such as Campfire? I think you mean Campside, maybe Campside or Wondery, or just look up the podcasts I like and cold call with resume. You could, honestly, I would do both. Like, I would definitely do both. And really good fact checkers are really hard to come by. So particularly if there's an area that you know a lot about, like if you have reported or fact checked or edited stories on a particular topic, I would try to go to those companies that do that kind of work. Like, for example, I work for a podcast company that does a lot of work on climate. I'm not a climate journalist, but I do some editing for them. And then they have fact checkers who like maybe more specialize in climate, or this particular series I'm working on has stories from all over the world. So the story that takes place in France, we had like a French speaking fact checker for, and a Spanish speaking fact checker for the one that took place in Costa Rica. So different kinds of things. But I would say both. I would like reach out cold. You could also send an email out to that listserv and just say, hey, I'm a fact checker looking for work. If you're in need of someone, let me know. You want to be careful and not do it too much, but I think that doing it once like is never a bad idea, to just put your name out there. And if no one responds, that the other thing Linda said to me was, the worst thing that happens is nothing. And I've thought about that a lot too. Like, if you put your name out there and no one responds, you're in the same place you're in now. So it made me feel more empowered to like go for it a little bit. But I also do think it's rare that companies hire full-time permanent fact checkers. I know that Gimlet used to have one, but I don't know if they do anymore. But a lot of companies will just contract them out for the shows that they need them for. When is the purchase of high-end mics worth it? I currently produce a podcast recorded with Riverside where I have no control over the interviewee sound. Okay, that's a good question. So I would say when you think about high-end mics, you can get some really good mics for not a ton of money. And even the mic that I used to record Short Creek cost like $100. So I think that it's an investment for sure, but I think if you go into a proper sound studio, you might see mics that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. I don't think that you need that. I think when you're thinking about your guest's sound, you want to get the best possible sound that you can get given your budget and their circumstances. So there are like kind of 3 or 4 ways to do it. One is if it's a really important guest or a really big get, like you get a celebrity or something like that, you can send a tape syncer to their house, which I mentioned before. You can ask them to go to a studio and pay for the studio rental time. You can use something like Riverside, or I've used Zencastr and felt that Zencastr had pretty decent quality audio. I don't know if it's better or worse than Riverside. And then also if you have a budget, but it's a smaller budget, you could record on Riverside and or Zencastr and then send to a producer or an engineer who knows how to EQ, and they can kind of clean it up to make it sound a little bit better. The other kind of low tech option that you have that we used to do sometimes when I worked at the NPR member station is you record them on Riverside or Zencastr or whatever it is, and then you ask them to tape sync themselves using like their iPhone. So you would tell them to hold their iPhone up while they're talking and record a voice memo and then send it to you at the end, which is a little tricky because if the file gets long, it gets hard to send. But I would say don't overinvest in mic equipment. $100, like I think the Shure SM57 is the standard vocal mic. It is brilliant. That and like a $10 pop filter will go a long, long way. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. If your content is really good, people can forgive a lot.
I just want, if Sarah's willing, anything she refers to. We've got Zencastr. We have a link now on chat for that. But we can send around, we can post a list of some of the resources you mentioned, like the listservs and some of the other things that you mentioned. But so that people who, because we have a question about please repeat the name of the listserv and how to join from.
Yeah. The listserv is called Public Radio NYC, and it's on Google Groups, and you have to have somebody who's on Google Groups on that listserv add you to it. So there's a way we can work that out. I'm sure we can figure it out afterwards, but like you just get someone who works in radio to add you to it. That's how you get on it. It's Public Radio NYC, I think at googlegroups.com. And then there's also subgroups for different people of different identities. So there's a group called Ladio, just for people who are women, trans, and non-binary identifying. There's one called Gadio for queer folks in radio. There's specific local ones. There's like a DC radio listserv. There's one in Arizona called AudioZona. So there's all different ones, but the big main one is called Public Radio NYC.
Sarah, we will be able to put whatever list you come up with for us on our chapter site, which is spjdc.org. So you can look for that. And I don't want to interrupt. Now we have a lot of these. Oh, Emma is not. Let's see. Okay. Oh,
so
and I think you just mentioned Ladio, right?
yeah. Emma mentioned Ladio and said that's a really good one. Yeah, I totally agree. I've had great success with that. If so, someone asked if I don't know someone in radio, how can I access it? Maybe afterwards, Celia, we can just like aggregate a group of people who want to be added to it, and I can add them. But we can
Okay, well,
probably
Sarah,
figure that out after. But yeah,
we know that you have a lot of work to do too. Now I see most of these are anonymous, but I do see that we have Princess and I don't know if we can get her to ask this question live, but I was going to try, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, for sure. So the question says, I intend to start a video podcast. I want it to focus on financial education for a very niche audience, Liberians. My one problem is that this will be the first of its kind for such an audience. I want to start it in a way that I do not risk losing their interest. Suggestions on ways to begin. So, okay, I don't know a lot about video podcasts. In fact, I don't know anything about them. So I want to give it that caveat. But I think the main thing is that you want the podcast to be compelling. And so there's a couple of ways to think about that. So one is that I would create your pilot episode and share it with someone and have them like take a look or listen to it. And someone who maybe could be in your target audience, but doesn't like is going to be willing to tell you if it's not working. Like you just need somebody who's going to be really honest with you. Someone, I think it was Danielle Alarcon who does Radio Ambulante said sometimes he would have like table reads where he would invite friends over for dinner and then they would play things for each other. So like, which I think is like such a beautiful way to create community around giving feedback. So basically I would like invite some friends over for dinner or people who what you think could be viewers or listeners of this podcast, play a pilot episode for them and get them to give you feedback on what they thought of it and watch their faces when they react to it too. Another mistake that I think a lot of people made is they think that podcasts have to be 45 minutes to an hour long. They do not. A lot of podcasts are much, much, much better at a shorter length. Maybe think about 20 to 25 minutes, especially for something like financial literacy, which is like not going to necessarily be the most compelling conversation topic, but is like something that you want to, information that you want to impart. I would also think about ways to make it compelling. So like, is there a story that you can tell as part of it? Is there a narrative involved? Is there a way to get at this information that isn't just sort of like telling someone the information? You can listen to other podcasts that have worked on similar financial issues and figure out if you like their style or not. But I know like Planet Money does a really great job of telling stories about money and economics and finances in a way that is actually compelling. So I would find ones that you like, try to break down what they do that makes it successful, like that they have a really good story or they have a really good talker or they break down the information in a really conversational way or whatever it is. And then don't try to replicate what they do, but take those elements and try to make sure you're incorporating those elements into the foundation of what you do. And I would also just say, don't feel like you have to be over ambitious about it. Maybe make a 10 episode season. You don't have to make a podcast every week for the rest of your life. Make 10 episodes as a season. At the end of the season, say, we're taking a season break. We're going to be back in a few months with a new season. We're going to tackle these issues. Also, if you can have ways for people to interact with it, to like write you questions or write you feedback or share their own story, people really like that too. And I think that's a helpful way also. Okay, after producing a podcast, what are the steps to have it aired? What is the distribution process? So this depends on how you want to do it. The kind of two main ways are that you can self-publish it, or that you can work with a distributor, which is often a company. If you're getting a podcast deal with a company, it can be complicated because they're going to want to have buy-in in what the podcast looks and sounds like. And so you're probably going to want to, or you probably will have pitched it to them before you get to the point of airing it. Occasionally, companies will take a podcast that's already pretty fully formed, but often they want some editorial input. So I would say you can shop it around to companies, which is where you're kind of like cold writing to companies and you're specifically reaching out to their like development coordinator or something like that and saying, hey, I have a pitch for a podcast, let's talk about it, and then creating a deal with them, which involves a contract, which you need to be really careful with. Or you can self-publish and then look at ways to market it yourself. And there are small companies or individuals that are really good at marketing that can help you kind of decide like, okay, I'm going to spend $500 to market my podcast. Here's how I can best spend that $500 to get the most bang for my buck. So there's ways to do it on a budget and ways to do it cheaply. But the best way is if you know people, because like being able to call in favors or being able to ask for help or being able to say like, hey, can I do a feed drop on your podcast and I'll do a feed drop for you on mine. Things like that are really great ways to do it. I'm not an expert in marketing either too, so there are other people who would probably be able to answer that a little better. What elements make a story good for a podcast? I have a background in television news production and I'm interested in doing news podcasts. Oh, that's such a good question. So I really try to think a lot about what audio's strengths are, and what its weaknesses are. But I think audio has a lot of strengths, and I really am kind of in love with it as a medium because I think it's very intimate. I think hearing someone's voice is a really beautiful way to get to hear a story. Um, and it's less cumbersome and less difficult than going into a place with a camera and lights and like all of the things that you would need to do a proper TV or video production. So I think about stories that have like first you need to think about just generally what makes a good story. Does it have a good narrative arc? Does it have tension? Does it have stakes? Does it have good characters? Are those characters good talkers? Can they explain their story well? Um, does it have multiple parts? Does it have places where I can, at the end of the episode, that's a good hook into the next episode? Can I take one episode and break it into two so that there's an ad break in the middle and there's like a little hook in the middle? Does it have enough movement? Does it have enough plot? If it's something that requires a lot of internal reflection, are the people you're interviewing able to do that kind of internal reflection? Have you written it for audio instead of writing it for TV or writing it for print? Can you tell the story in a compelling way? I mean, I think there's like lots and lots of questions you can and should ask, but I was always say like, think about, is it a story that I want to hear? Do I know where the tension is? Do I know who the characters are? Um, is it a story that like I would want to listen to on my earbuds when I'm commuting or when I'm going for a walk or when I'm doing dishes or running errands? Or is it like, am I going to be able to follow it? Like I would think about all those things, but really, does it have tension, stakes, and hooks? I think those are pretty important. And why is it important? Like, why is it important and meaningful?
I think you've answered like 13 questions, and I think that I don't think we'll burden you with tax question. But
Okay.
I thought that was a great segue to Unfinished Creek. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that podcast and what drew you to the story and how the reporting, because you spent 4 years making the podcast, how that reporting changed you as a person.
It changed me a lot. Yeah, that was like, to that point, that was the hardest story I had ever worked on. And it was a really complicated story because I think it made me, I'm very interested in what are called liminal spaces. So, for example, something that isn't one thing or another, but it exists in the intersection of the two. So if you think about um, like people often talk about the US Mexico border with the liminal space, like the borderland is not entirely the United States, it's not entirely Mexico, it's this kind of in between space. Or if I think about, someone who I'm struggling to think of a better example than that right now, but I'm interested in the people like you're not in a church or out of a church, you're somewhere in between. So I focus a lot on religion reporting. And so this was a story about a religious community that was existing at a moment where it had completely been run as a religious town, as a theocracy, and was being forced by the United States government to become a democracy. And at that moment, I felt that it was really in that unique in between transitional space. And it was really a special moment. So it made me sort of see things in a very, very, very nuanced way. Because I think before going to that community and before spending so much time there, I really felt like I knew who were going to be the like people that I would agree with and the people that I didn't agree with, or the people who were doing good things and the people who weren't doing good things. And what I found was something so much more complicated than that. And of course, like I should have realized that going in, but I think it's different to be in those situations. And it's made me look at a lot of people and situations in my life in a much more complicated, nuanced way. Um, so I'm really like, I think that I've begun to see a lot more complexity, and it's allowed me to start to think about approaching other projects that require that kind of empathy and complexity.
You know, um, uh, I was wondering, I mean, you took a lot of time with this and you spent some time right in the community for how many months?
3 months.
So how did that happen and what made it possible? And how did it feel to be in this community, like you said, which is really a liminal space, not one thing or the other thing. Where did you stay? That's on Short Creek, and very interesting, a story in itself.
Yeah. So, this is, in case people haven't listened to the podcast, this is the community on the Utah-Arizona border that's home to the FLDS Church, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes referred to as like the fundamentalist Mormon community. You may know it because there have been a handful of other documentaries that have come out since my podcast came out about it. The prophet of that community is Warren Jeffs. He's in prison for sexual assaulting minors. So, and it's famous because of that, and also because it's a polygamous community. So men have multiple wives. So I had been reporting on the community for a few years. It's about a 6-hour drive from Phoenix. So I would drive up for like the weekend or for a few days and then drive back down. And then at some point I decided I wanted to spend an extended period of time there. And the way I decided that was because I felt very strongly that, number one, every time I left the community, like 2 days later, somebody would text me and say, "Hey, are you still here? Are you coming to this thing? There's something happening." And I felt like things were happening so fast in that community, I just couldn't keep up with them. And then the other thing was that, again, I mentioned that I didn't study journalism, I studied anthropology. And I was really interested in taking kind of more of an ethnographic approach to journalism. And I wondered what it would look like to really this is a community that feels very, very misunderstood and that is extremely distrustful of journalists. So what would it look like if I spent as much time there as I possibly could? And I think the theme of really showing up is a pretty important one, because their accusation of many journalists, which I think was true, was that people would come in, get like a quick quote, tell a really sensationalized story, leave, and never come back. And so by staying there, I wanted to show them, number one, I have a commitment to being here. I'm not going to leave tomorrow. I'm going to be here for a while. Number two, they knew where I lived, which the answer to that question is that I lived in the former prophet's house. So I didn't live in Warren Jeff's house. I lived in his father's house, which at that point had been turned into a place that was part hotel and part apartments. So I rented a room there. It was like, had previously been a sister wives room. And I stayed in his house for 3 months. So everybody knew where I lived. And so I thought, like, this is really me sort of like, as journalists, we have this immense power, right? And there's a huge power differential between us and our subjects. And I think there are a lot of things that we as an industry need to do to try to address that. But I thought in this case, one of the only things I could do ethically was to make myself vulnerable to this community. And I thought, by letting them know where I live, answering questions about my own life, being really honest about who I am and where I come from, and allowing them to see me when I wasn't at my best, those were ways that I felt like I could level the playing field a little bit. So, when you go on a 1-week reporting trip, you're just on the whole week, and then you get back from your reporting trip and you like decompress at your house. There was no decompression. So people saw me when I was really tired, and when I had a headache, and when I was like in a bad mood at the grocery store or whatever it was. And I think that it actually made a difference for them to see that, and for them to see that I would keep showing up to all the community things, not just the ones that would produce like a sensationalized story, but that I would go to their city council meetings until midnight. It was not very glamorous work, but I think it was really, really important.
I think, Sarah, that one of the things that's very interesting about you is when listening to the documentary, there are those places where you are empathetic and vulnerable, and where you don't put people into good and bad, or the reactionaries and the progressives. And I just wondered how you put together your code of ethics, because clearly you have a code of ethics. And maybe you could share that, because as much as we need to know about the equipment and the merchandising and everything, if we don't do podcasts and other kind of journalism that really serves people, it doesn't matter if we're like really good at it.
I agree. Thank you. This is a hard question because, as I said, I started in public radio. And so public radio's code of ethics was the one I was using at the beginning. And even when I left public radio, I thought, well, this is a good one to stand by. And then at some point I realized I had to sort of figure out what worked for me, and that maybe what worked in public radio wasn't going to work in this kind of a situation. And also that what I was doing was so different than what a lot of other people do, that there's not a good ethics handbook for it. So there were a couple things. So one is, I think it's really important, if you can, to have, ideally it's an editor, but at the very least some person in your life that you can run ethical things by, because at some point you just get so confused, or I felt like I got so confused there. It was really hard to draw appropriate boundaries, and sometimes I did and sometimes I missed the mark. I mean, I made mistakes for sure, so I want to be really clear about that. I kept thinking about the fact that I am a journalist, but I'm a human first. And I thought a lot about what it meant to try to be an ethical and a moral person in this setting, and what were my responsibilities, not just as a journalist, but like, if I look back at this time at the end of my life, will I feel okay about it? If the podcasts come out, will I feel like I've done right by the people that I interviewed? And I told people that, like, you might not be happy with this podcast. Like, I can't promise you you're going to be okay with it. I can't promise you you're going to be comfortable with it. I can't promise you you're going to like it. What I can promise you is that I'm going to be as respectful as I possibly can, and that I really want to hear your story and I take you seriously. And I think for a lot of people that made a difference, and they saw that, I think, as some kind of honesty, because I wasn't just saying, oh, you're going to love it, you're going to look great, you're going to whatever. Like, I didn't give them that assurance. But what I did tell them was, like, I do care about respecting you, and I do care about the fact that, like, you've been mistreated by journalists and media members in the past, and it's my goal to not do that. Now, not everybody felt like that at the end. There were some people who were still upset, but I know that, like, I thought about it a lot, and I had a lot of internal struggle about how to approach it. So I guess at the end of the day, the sort of line I kept coming back to was, I'm a journalist, but I'm a person first, and that my job is to not make clear judgments about the people that I'm reporting on, but instead to try to understand who they are and why they believe what they believe, because that really is what is determining how they run their lives and how this community is functioning. And ultimately, I think we all struggle to live in community with each other. We live in a very polarized moment in time, and taking the time to try to understand why someone believes what they believe, especially when you really disagree with it, is really important.
Just add that spj.org, you can find our code of ethics, which is very extensive. We're revamping it now, but it certainly, a lot of that, the code of ethics is more about, when not to lie, not to cheat, not to, it goes into a lot of nitty gritty about, talking on the record, off the record, all that stuff. But I think what you are bringing to the table, Sarah, is this inner feeling about how I relate to that person who's my subject, and over whom I do have a lot of power. And,
Right.
and I think that they both are very important. The formal codes of ethics are very important, but also is that acknowledgement by journalists that they frame the story. They are in charge of how we perceive reality, this reality. So you could have done a real number on Short Creek. There was, and were you surprised when it got so much acknowledgement by the larger world? You put together a 10-part series about this small community of believers and non-believers and sort of in the middle believers, without taking sides, really. It shy away from things like abuse or child marriage or polygamy, but it didn't sensationalize it. Were you surprised that the New Yorker and Atlantic thought so much of it?
I think I was, because at a certain point, and I think this happens in a lot of creative processes, but at a certain point, I couldn't tell if what I was doing was good. I couldn't tell if it was going to be a good story. I just got so lost in it. Like, people would ask me, how's your podcast going? And I would say, I don't know. And they'd be like, what do you mean? I'd be like, I don't know. I'm working on it every day. I can't tell if it's good anymore or not. I really don't know. And they thought I was being self-deprecating, but really I was being honest. Like I just got so lost in that story. I couldn't release it. I was like having dreams about it. I would wake up in the morning and have had a dream about Short Creek. Like it was just happening a lot. It was like constantly with me. So I was hopeful that there would be that people would want to hear a story that wasn't sensationalized. So I was really grateful for that. I was surprised because I didn't know if we had hit that mark, and I still sometimes don't know, but I know that we worked really hard and we tried to make something that was meaningful, and I feel really grateful that there were people who found it meaningful. And I think the other thing I want to just add to sort of what you were saying before, Celia, too, is that in addition to have, we have this massive power differential with our subjects. And I think one thing that we sometimes forget is that once we put something out into the world, it lives there forever. And often we're not the ones that deal with the consequences of it. The people who we've reported on are. So again, I believe in holding people to account. I don't believe in sugarcoating things. I don't believe in not talking about abuse. If you listen to the podcast, I asked someone to his face, if he married a 14-year-old. Like, so there's a lot of things that I think are really important to examine and to investigate. And at the same time, I believe that we should all be treated with a certain amount of dignity and humanity. And so I think we have to try to find a way to do that. If I can be really candid, what I found frustrating was that afterwards there were a lot of TV shows and series that came out about the community that I didn't think approached the community with any kind of delicacy. And it's frustrating because, as proud as I was of the listenership we had, it was nothing compared to shows that exist on streaming services, which took a much more sensationalized approach. So yeah,
we can deal with one more. Jennifer has asked a question. What tools do you use to keep your podcast notes and reporting organized? Especially for an ongoing investigation, it can get overwhelming with audio files. How do you deal with
it? Yeah, and I want to try to address Hussein's question after if I can.
Sure.
But yes, so okay, couple things. So I use a lot of spreadsheets for keeping track of all of my sources, like all of their audio files. Like I keep like big spreadsheets with links to all of those things. And you can also put kind of keywords in your spreadsheet where you're like, I did an interview with Celia and she talked about XYZ. I did an interview with Sarah and she talked about, A, B, and C. And so then you can kind of like start to categorize things. Like a lot of it is actually like quantitative social science methods where you can then sort of, control F and say, okay, which sources talked about polygamy? And then you get the 10 sources that come up and then you can go back to their tape. A lot of it is also like when you do a lot of reporting, you get to know the sources really well. And so you start to remember like people's stories really well. And a lot of it becomes internal. But I do think there's a lot of organization that has to happen that way. The other thing is at the time we used Trint, I know everybody's using Descript now. And we would go through and highlight transcripts and we would color code the highlighting. And but it was hard. We had like 125 hours of tape for a series that ended up being like 8 hours. So 95% of it, I think, didn't make it in. So yeah, I would say lots of spreadsheets. I use Descript sometimes. I use Trint sometimes. I do a lot of storyboarding. I use Murrow, Miro, which has a lot of like, it's like a virtual sticky note board and you can kind of, what I like to call murder wall the story and pinpoint things and draw lines to each other. I use Monday.com sometimes to work on production timelines and calendaring.
And we can work with Sarah and see if we can post a lot of those tools. I know you want to answer Hussein's question, which is a good one, and we have just about 5 minutes left.
Perfect.
So
Hussein asks, I'm a master's of journalism specializing in audio. Do you have any advice on how to best use my time in school, especially when audio internships are shrinking up? Yes, I think that's a really good question. So I would say, number one is like to learn as many skills as you possibly can, and to also get a sense of what you don't know and what you're probably not going to learn in school, because you have a limited amount of time there, so there's only so much you can learn. And it's okay not to learn everything, but maybe you keep a running list of like skills that you want to work on that you didn't learn in school. Like, I'm not very good at sound design. That's like on my permanent list of things, is like I want to be better at sound design. So when sound design workshops come up, I always try to take them. So I would say that. The second thing is I would say to listen to as much as you possibly can and start reaching out to those people whose work you like now, and also to form really good relationships with your cohort, because I think that having that mutual moral support is really, really, really helpful and important going forward. And then, yeah, those internships are drying up. I would say like getting that first one is always the hardest. And so it may mean doing something like cleaning transcripts for people first, or doing a couple of tape syncs, or the other thing that I think people don't do as much anymore, but I did a lot when I was at NPR starting out, is I would ask if I could shadow. So even if you don't get the internship, I was trying to get temp work at NPR, and I would ask producers or editors, can I shadow you for an afternoon? And I would literally just sit behind them and watch them work and take notes, and if they had time, I would ask them questions. And I think that that's a great way both for you to learn and see what processes are like, but also then people see you there and they introduce themselves to you and you introduce themselves to them and you meet them. So I would say like, look at that and then apply for as many internships as you can. And then also just like see what is available locally to you where you live.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for being part of tonight's webinar. And listen to Unfinished Short Creek, a terrific piece of journalism. We will be sure to have a link to the podcast on this video once we post it on YouTube and on our website, spjdc.org. Also, chapter will be holding another webinar Tuesday, January 23rd, and the topic is putting a local tinge to global stories. This will be held in cooperation with the SPJ international community. Chapter president and executive editor for the Alexandria Times, Denise Dunbar, will discuss how her publication finds ways to give a local angle to important national and global stories. Sarah, you were magnificent, and you are a true journalist and a lovely human being.
Thank you, Celia. So are you. I feel the same about you. Celia just won an award from the Religion News Association. That's actually how we met, through RNA. It's incredible. So congrats to you, Celia. And thank you all so much for having me. I'm really happy that I got to be here.
We will make available a lot of stuff that Sarah mentioned. We will find a way to post it on spjdc.org. So stay tuned.
Thank you all so much.